I love the idea of taking a tiny bug and dressing it up in a camel costume. But do you know why I love that idea? Because that's how hard we work to get ourselves out of this text. Lily, you said it on behalf of a whole bunch of adults. It was awesome. And we know that Jesus met a whole lot of other rich people and didn't tell them to do this. And so this was specific to this situation. But I think that we shouldn't let ourselves out of it too quickly. But we're going to set all of that aside. I'm going to talk about this morning's meeting for just a minute, and then we're going to go a completely different direction with this text. So just to name the elephant in the room, there's a couple of people here who don't have any idea what's going on, but most people at least got the letter. Our secretary was fired a few weeks ago, and since then we have found that money has been embezzled. And I won't go into any detail about that. There's lots of ways you can get more detail. But I do want to remind us of a few things, because to a greater and a lesser degree, everyone here feels like they have been hurt, and we all grieve for the loss. Not only the loss of money, which is a lot, that's a lot on our hearts, but this sense of safety and trust that people always had around here. I've heard that quite a few times over the past week. And so we live in this time together, and we don't really have any resolution. That's another question that comes up is, when is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? And of course, it's all in the bureaucracy, and it's probably going to be a month from now before we see anything else happen. And that seems like a long time to wait, but that's just the speed that things move. And so we have lots of questions floating around, not about specifics. Those are easy to answer. If you have a question about specifics, find me, find a council member after worship. That's no big deal. But the questions of what now, and what can I do, and how could this happen? And a whole lot of the sentiment of, I can't believe this being in shock. And so I'm just going to give you 3 concrete things that we can do. If they don't sound like good ideas to you, just leave them. But if you're looking, 3 concrete things we can do. The first is to guard your heart and to know that Christ wants to stand guard with you. That comes from an obscure passage out of Proverbs, but it gets quoted pretty often, and Paul picks it up in his letter to the Philippians. It's easy to let ourselves become downhearted, to harden our hearts, to let our hearts sink, all of those things. And yet none of those really help us to build up the body of Christ, to allow God's kingdom to be known in the world. So each person in here knows what the weak spot in their heart is. Everybody has one. Some, it's harsh words. Some people, it's withdrawing and a defeated attitude. Some people, it's anger that gets to the point that they can't see the person next to them. Whatever it is for you, whatever it is that you know you need to guard your heart against, this is probably a time you need to be vigilant about that. So Jesus has room to work in you, and we accept Christ's help in making our hearts a safe place, not only for ourselves, but for the world, because this doesn't stop what we're doing. It doesn't stop Christ's message in the world. Second thing to do, so guard your heart. Second thing to do is pray. And I've had a couple of people ask me what to pray for, and I think that at this point, it doesn't much matter. Just keep in prayer. Keep up your relationship with God and find that healing love of Christ at every turn. You'll know what to pray for. Everybody might be called to pray for something different. But make sure you keep up that relationship with God. Because prayer is amazing and it's powerful. And if you haven't experienced that before, maybe this is your chance to experience it. Maybe your chance to experience God's love as you encounter it through prayer. And the third thing is to lean into the resurrection. Because as Christians, resurrection is what defines us. Christ rose again so that nothing will ever separate us from the love of God, not even death. And so we do this all the time. We lean into that new life. Perhaps even right now, we put our shoulder or our hip into it and really lean into that new life. But even though that's always true, it's especially important to come together and do that right now. Because every time we have a choice to make, we can decide what is defining that choice. Whether we're going to be defined by our hurt, or we're going to be defined by once burnt, twice shy, or whether we're going to be defined by resurrection. Defined by what it means that we're going to let Jesus in and completely do everything we can to continue to be God's light in the world. To take it one step farther, we can think about when we have those choices about not letting anything separate not only ourselves, but our neighbor from the love of God. Not letting anything separate our neighbor from the love of God, because that's what resurrection is all about, is taking that barrier away. And so we work with that in ourselves. So there's my 3 answers. If you still want to ask me, I can try and come up with something more specific for you, but in general, those are my 3 answers. Guard your heart, pray, keep up your relationship with God, and lean into resurrection. Every time you have a choice, lean into the resurrection and let that define you. That's who we are as people of Christ. And if we set ourselves about doing those 3 things, we'll be very far on our way in ensuring that this is nothing more than a speed bump in our ministry, because it doesn't need to be anything more than that. We're going to have a lot of emotions to deal with. Some of us have had a while to deal with those already, and for some of us, that's pretty new. But everybody knows emotions pass, and we're going to live into God's love, live into that resurrection together. So now we'll shift our focus to the gospel reading for today. From one money situation here to a money situation a long time ago, from one set of people, or at least one person, who was confused and grieving, to another set of people who are confused and grieving. This text interplays with what we're doing in more ways than one. But the part of this text that really grabbed my attention this week, is something that I hadn't ever paid a whole lot of attention to until this week. For all the other things it brings up, a lot of times we skip over the part, just the very fact that this man had a life-changing encounter with Jesus. Now, considering we're reading out of the Gospels, especially the Gospel of Mark, this doesn't seem terribly odd. Encounters with Jesus are sort of what keep the storyline going. It's what makes the narrative function. But as we come here today, with all of our stories, with all of their pieces, I talked about one little piece of the story that involves our life together, but there are so many more pieces of the story that go out in every direction. We come here today wanting to encounter Jesus. That's basically why we get together on Sunday mornings, is to encounter Jesus. Wanting to have our hearts guarded against the hurt of the world. Wanting to be pulled more deeply into the relationship with God through prayer and praise and worship. Wanting to be made whole at the communion table and have the divisions among us sealed shut. Wanting to know new life. We want to come encounter Jesus. And so it's important to us that this man did encounter Jesus. He actually did that. But when the man encounters Jesus, it changes everything. Jesus doesn't just make him a bigger, better, less broken, more perfect version of himself. He makes him a completely new person. We know that he went away. We don't know whether he went away because he was going to go sell everything. Jesus did tell him to do that before he followed. And there would certainly be grieving involved with that, regardless. Or whether he went away to go back home and to stay with all of his stuff. We don't know which way it went. It's kind of a cliffhanger there. But what we do know is that he will never be the same person. That man that we don't know anything about, we know one fact about him, well, two. We know two facts about him. He was Jewish because he said he'd kept the commandments, and he had lots of possessions. About as generic a person as you can get. But we know that he will never be the same. We have had faith so long, and it's in the culture around us so much, that we have made encountering Jesus seem normal and every day. And sometimes we even go so far as to make it seem like that if you don't have faith, if you don't encounter Jesus on a regular basis, that doesn't make any sense. But how often is it the other way around? How often is it that when we encounter Jesus, our lives are totally changed? Totally changed. We come up with problems that we would have never, ever even thought of had we not had faith. Had we not gone up to Jesus and said, "What else do I need to do?" And Jesus answers us. We wouldn't have those problems, those places where we're different from the world, those places where our faith makes us strange. Faith makes us whole and brings us to new life, but it also makes us strange, and that's what happens when we encounter Jesus. Because encountering Jesus changes us forever, and it changes the world around us because of that. It calls us to let go of everything we lean on and let ourselves be made new. For that man in our story, that was his possessions. He was leaning on the fact that he kept the commandments, and God had obviously blessed him with his possessions. But he was leaning on that. He was leaning on what he could do instead of leaning on Christ. There's a story by William Willimon that I think is funny and applies here. So there was a revival preacher, and he'd preached all morning, and he was really going on it. And everybody was up in the aisles, and they were all singing, and he decided he's going to have his altar call now. And just to be clear, I'm not doing an altar call. If anybody just woke up at that very moment, we're not doing an altar call. But this revival preacher, he decided he was going to have an altar call. And he's like, okay, everybody's ready for it. We're going to have an altar call. All these people are going to encounter Jesus. It's awesome. And so he yells out, "Come to the altar and give your life to Christ." And it went silent. Everybody sat down and nobody came up. So he pondered a minute. And in frustration, the evangelist said, "Come to the altar. Come to the altar, my children, of saying, as a way of saying that you love God and you're going to honor God with your life. And that was the sound he heard. You know, these people who had just been cheering and singing praise music. And so the evangelist says, okay, you guys, come on down to the altar as a way of saying that you want to improve your life. You want to do better. Nobody came. They all just hung out right where they were. And he said, finally, he said, okay, y'all, if you love your mama, come down to the altar. And a few people stood up. Somebody in that story understood. Somebody understood that encountering Jesus and being made new doesn't solve all of our problems. It doesn't take away the fact that we live in this world. Sometimes, in fact, it's just the beginning of them, like it was for the man in our story today. But the problems are completely different. It's a completely different world once you have encountered Jesus. Nothing is ever the same again because, and here's the good news, we have new life. And yes, with that new life comes new problems. And it comes with the stress of being changed, and it comes with all of the changes to the world, whether that's different friends or different job or maybe something subtle like changing your bedtime routine because you want to say prayers before you go to bed. Whatever it is. But all of those come with new life. We actually get to experience forgiveness. We actually get to be that guy who encounters Jesus and have our lives be changed. Changed by that love of God. That the resurrection isn't in this story, but we know where it's going. We know that our lives get to be changed by the fact that Jesus rose again so that nothing can ever separate us from the love of God, not even death. We know that. We experience that. We experience that with each other. We experience that at the font and the table and as we encounter the Word. And we experience that in our lives as God works through the most amazing people that you would have never guessed to bring new life. And so, as our story intersects with this story on a whole lot of levels, we walk away from it new, different, never the same again, because we have encountered Jesus. So as you go through this week, or longer than this week, whenever, keep your eyes out not only for those places where you have new problems or that there's stress about things changing or whatever it is, but where you have found hope, where you found that joy that doesn't make any sense, but you have it anyway, where the peace that shouldn't be there fills your heart, where you can speak a word of grace or help to a neighbor so that they understand that peace too. See all the ways that encountering Jesus today has changed you, because we are changed when we encounter Jesus. And may your heart seek those encounters with Jesus in every way. And may you find the love and the light you seek for yourself to heal your own heart in every place you find yourself in and every new place God calls you to go. Amen.